I'm joined, my first guest is Manish Tewari, Congress MP and member of Parliamentary Group on Defence, the Consultative Committee of Parliament on Defence. Manish Tewari, appreciate your joining us. Since the government has announced the Agnipath scheme, we've seen massive protests already in the last 48 hours in Central and North India. Army aspirants worried about their future. Do you also appreciate the fear and anxiety of the aspirants as an opposition leader and someone who tracks national security?
Rajdeep, I absolutely empathize with the fears, apprehensions and anxieties of the young people who are protesting. However, having said that, we need to understand that the nature of warfare has completely transformed itself over the past decade or decade and a half. And the armed forces are not an employment guarantee program. Going back almost 3 decades now, most armed forces have transitioned to a very light footprint on the ground while being very heavy on technology and weaponry. So therefore, under those circumstances, if India requires a younger profile for its armed forces, if it requires that ultimately its pension bill also comes within manageable limits, you need to transition to a new paradigm. So therefore, this is a scheme which the government has announced. It should be allowed to play itself out. And if at all there are any glitches, those glitches can be ironed out. I think what the government needs to give clarity on is the transitioning process post 4.5 years. Because I can understand somebody coming out at the age of 21 or 22, he or she would obviously be apprehensive about their future. So a transitioning process which takes you out of the armed forces and into some form of regular employment, whether in the paramilitary forces or the state police forces, is something which the government must build into the scheme. And I think that to a large extent will be able to allay the apprehensions of people.
It's very interesting, Manish Tewari, because you seem to be welcoming the scheme on a day when your party and many other opposition leaders are very critical of it. Rahul Gandhi has spoken out against it strongly on Twitter, has said that with threats on 2 fronts, schemes like this will reduce the operational readiness of the army. He's saying it is playing with the future of the youth of the country. And says BJP should stop playing with the dignity and traditions of the forces. So you clearly are actually again at odds with your party leadership on the issue of Agnipath.
Well, Rajdeep, without making any value judgment on something which somebody else may have said, I have written extensively with regard to civil-military relations in my book, which was released in the December of 2021. And let me point out as to how the current nature of the Indian armed forces came into existence. You see, before 1857, the British essentially had 3 armies: the Madras Army, the Calcutta Army and the Bombay Army. And the recruitment into these armed forces were from and amongst high-class or upper-caste Hindus. It is during the First War of Independence in 1857 when the sepoys of the Bengal Army, who were in the vanguard of this revolt/struggle for independence, that the British actually coined the martial race theory. There was a Jonathan Peel Commission in 1859, and then they identified 15 castes from which they thought or who had been friendly to the British during the First War of Independence, and they would start recruiting from these particular castes, and most of them were located in North India. So between 1870 and 1945, till the end of the Second World War, there was very heavy recruitment from Delhi all the way up to the Khyber Pass, which in Pakistan is of course called the Punjabiization of the army. But that is essentially how these martial caste regiments came into existence. Way back in 1966, we tried to correct this anomaly by bringing in something called the recruitment male population policy, whereby recruitment into the armed forces would be a percentage of the population of that particular state or union territory into the population of India. So therefore, under those circumstances, to continue with a paradigm which was put in place by the British imperialists for entirely ulterior reasons in the 21st century, I really do not see any rationale to it.
You know, you're giving us an excellent exposition on the history of the evolution of the Indian Army. But clearly, as I said, your party leadership feels differently. Many others feel differently because they are looking at politics and society at the moment. In 21st century India, Manish Tewari, there are a number of people, lakhs of unemployed youngsters who see the army as their only hope and future. They are now worried what will happen to them after this 4-year tour of duty. To use now Priyanka Gandhi Vadra's words, again your party leader, you can't use the army as a laboratory for your experiments.
Well, in my calculus, Rajdeep, with great respect to people who may hold opposing views, national security and politics fall into two different buckets. And in my estimation, as we look to the remaining decades of the 21st century, India requires an extremely mobile army or a mobile armed force. It requires what is called an expeditionary force, a force which is younger in age profile, which is far, far more proficient insofar as technology and weaponry is concerned. So therefore, there has to be a paradigm shift in the entire structure of our armed forces. And as I earlier respectfully pointed out, the armed forces are there for protecting the sovereignty and integrity of the nation. They are not an employment guarantee program.
No, you're saying something very strong, that the armed forces are not here as an employment guarantee scheme, Mr. Tewari. They're here to protect the nation. But, you know, the fact is this a message which political parties can easily take to the people of the country? People want employment. They see army as an employment opportunity.
Well, ultimately, that's the entire raison d'etre of an armed force. Why do you raise an armed force of the Union? Look at what is the constitutional role enjoined upon an armed force. It is to protect the unity and integrity of the country. And therefore, under those circumstances, as I said, that the entire nature of warfare has completely changed. We are in what is called the informationized warfare age. And as I was earlier pointing out, that we are heading to a situation whereby you could also be in a specter of contactless warfare, where increasing reliance on artificial intelligence, drone technologies, robotics, etc. is going to define the entire nature and future of warfare. Is there any pragmatism in continuing with very an army or an armed force which has a very heavy human footprint? In fact, if you go back to the debates in the US during the 80s and the 90s, these debates, especially with regard to higher defense reform, focused upon completely reforming their armed forces. And in fact, one of the biggest votaries of a mobile and light footprint armed force was Donald Rumsfeld, not everybody's favorite person, but the fact is that some of the seminal reforms in the way the US armed forces are structured were introduced by him, and this is a pattern which has been followed by almost every other armed force in the world.
So very interesting. Manish Tewari, Congress leader, is now coming out in a way in support of the government scheme at a time when it would appear many others in his party are opposing it. Interesting viewpoint there from Manish Tewari, saying the army cannot be an employment guarantee scheme in the country.